talk about the sexiest game I know. A game that's so deviant it needs hard limits and hit points, charisma checks and critical hits, safe words and saving throws. And to keep us all in line, a dungeon master who can praise us or punish us depending on our roles. Welcome to Dungeons and Dragons. Over the past year, Dungeons and Dragons has really taken center stage, and I do mean this literally. A game that used to be confined to a small group of friends, typically played in a basement, is now selling out arenas. Not thousands, but millions of people tune in every week to watch people play this game. We have professional Dungeons and Dragons groups like Critical Role and Dimension 20 who have millions of people watching every episode, and that's no small feat for a game that typically has a minimum playtime of 2 hours. We have movies about this game that have hit the big screen, video game adaptations that have become the best selling video games of all time. So I think it's fair to say that Dungeons and Dragons has finally broken out of its lonely, nerdy stereotype that seems to have haunted it since it was created in the 1970s, and it has finally made it mainstream. And because of its popularity both in these niche communities and now in a wider community, it's attracted a lot of academic attention over the past 2 decades, particularly from researchers singing the praises of the emotional and social benefits that can come from playing this game. But what I am interested in is a small but significant subset of research that looks at the surprising connection of Dungeons and Dragons to kink. Maybe this won't come as a surprise to anyone who's inhabited either spaces, but there is a lot of crossover, both in the people who inhabit these spaces and in the structure and function of these spaces themselves. The what may be clear here, but the why is still inviting a lot of conversation. And scholars who have touched this topic have said that this notable connection is criminally understudied, which tends to happen with fun topics of research. So I kind of see this as my bat signal. As an academic who's made a name for themselves for their kinky history series and a lifelong lover of RPGs, I feel like it's my time to weigh in. I have proudly been part of the Dungeons and Dragons and kink community for many years now, so I feel like I can speak to insights from my own experience here, as well as unpack some of the amazing research that has been done into either or both of these communities. Because the crossover to me was pretty apparent from the very beginning. I remember playing my first Dungeons and Dragons campaign at 18 and having to roll a persuasion check to see if I could make it into a brothel. Nat 1, baby. And also, anyone who's ever been to a kink convention can easily tell you that there is a lot of stripped down adaptations of famous gaming characters. Turns out that the Amulet of Mara has very different meanings depending on where you are. So today, I want to go through some of the similarities between these two communities, from the game structure itself to the deeper ethoses behind both of these spaces, and hopefully convey to you why this matters. So without further ado, let's roll for initiative and let's get going. The concept of the magic circle comes from the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga from a publication in 1938. Now, he argued that all play takes place inside of a special bounded space that is separate from ordinary life. And within this circle, different rules, meanings, and values apply. Play is a free activity, standing quite consciously outside of ordinary life as being not serious, but at the same time absorbing the player intensely and utterly. Classic examples of this would be a child building a fort in the backyard, a sports field, or even a chessboard. Now, in this space, throwing a ball at someone or moving a horse in an L shape isn't considered real combat. It only has meaning because of the agreed upon rules. Now, he also laid out some pretty clear rules of play, such as play is always separate from real life. Play has a location and a duration, and in play, the rules are the rules and they are not negotiable. Now, in Dungeons and Dragons, the table that we come to becomes the magic circle. Not a real one. That would be pretty cool if anyone has one going. Players agree as they sit down at the table that we are no longer in sunny Melbourne. We are now in the Forgotten Realms. We are now exploring Faerun. Dice rolls, character sheets, and the Dungeon Master's rulings become the laws of reality within this circle. And as everyone agrees and sits down at the table, they consent to suspend their disbelief and pretend together. Now, this really isn't that different to the concept of play and scenes in BDSM. BDSM scenes also create a magic circle of sorts, a consensual, imaginative space where normal social rules are suspended and they're replaced by the agreed upon rules of the scene. The idea is very much the same. When you step into the scene, the meaning of every action is transformed. One scholar has even gone so far as to describe BDSM scenes as a frame of play, a temporary structure that allows everyone inside to treat, for example, real pain as play pain, because the rules of the interpretation have now shifted. Very much like in Dungeons and Dragons, you need a clear entrance and a clear exit, which is why kinksters rely on rituals of negotiation before and aftercare afterwards to mark the boundary of entering and exiting that circle. And we are going to talk about that in much more detail. But what I really want to pause here and say is that when we talk about the overlap of kink and gaming, this is one of the strongest parallels. Both are about protected bubbles of play, where the ordinary is transformed into the extraordinary. Whether it's dungeons with dice or dungeons with handcuff, the circle is essentially what makes the adventure possible in the first place. Structured imagination is another key feature, both in D&D and in kink, which is basically an academic way of saying make-believe, but add spreadsheets. In D&D, the dungeon masters and the players collectively storytell, imagining roles like adventuring teenagers and flying corn cuties inside of a fantasy narrative. In BDSM, partners might also roleplay scenarios with agreed upon power dynamics, though the monsters in that game tend to have 3 legs instead of 2. It is all about building a shared fantasy together, and crucially, we do it with rules. Now in D&D, these rules are quite literal. We have character sheets, dice, a dungeon master's rulings. You can't just walk in and say, I slayed the dragon. You have to roll for initiative, check your hit points, and then argue for far too long about whether or not that fireball actually reached. The rules give weight to the imagination. They make it real enough to matter. Now, kink basically does the same thing. Partners don't just walk into the room and say, surprise me. They negotiate the rules, they set the limits, and they have agreed upon signals. The rules of the scene, whether it is, you can call me madam, or you stop when I say red, all give shape to the fantasy. They make it safe, consensual, and believable. And now in both cases, the structure doesn't kill creativity, it unlocks it. The fantasy frees you to dive deeper into fantasy because you know that you are within the boundaries, within the magic circle, and that you are safe. Consent is absolutely everything, and I think in kink, that's obvious. Before you even tie a knot, a negotiation has to take place. What are your limits? What are your fantasies? What are your absolute no-goes? Everyone involved has to agree before a scene even begins. And the same principles show up at the Dungeons and Dragons table. In recent years, role-playing groups have developed new safety tools, ways of making sure that the adventure is fun and not traumatic for everyone involved. The most popular one is called Session 0. Now that is a meeting that takes place before your dice even hit the table, and it gives players a chance to discuss what they want out of their game and, very importantly, what they don't want. This is where players may discuss their lines and veils. This was a tool developed by RPG designer Rod Edwards in the early 2000s, and it helps groups manage sensitive and potentially triggering content before your gameplay even begins. A line is a hard boundary. This content will not appear in the game at all. For instance, I may say no harm to animals and no questions asked, no owlbears will be harmed throughout this campaign. In BDSM terms, this is a hard limit, the equivalent of an absolute no. Don't even go there. Now, your veils are your soft boundaries. This content can exist in the game, but it will be veiled, not described in detail, often known as a fade to black. For instance, your characters may decide to do a horizontal tango with one another, but it will be implied rather than described. And here the lights dim and the camera pans away.
What do you think Mom and Dad are doing right now?
Now in BDSM terms, this is a soft limit, something that you're okay with, but only under certain conditions and negotiations. There are even safety mechanics that look exactly like safe words. Take for instance, the X card. If something in the game makes a player uncomfortable, they simply tap the card and the scene shifts immediately. There are no questions asked. It's the tabletop equivalent of saying red. Instant stop. Everyone resets and trust remains intact. For decades, the BDSM community has championed mottos like safe, sane, and consensual. This means activities should be as safe as possible for everyone should be sound of mind, and most importantly, everyone has enthusiastically consented. Now, later, a newer framework has emerged, RAC, Risk-Aware Consensual Kink. This one is aware that you can never eliminate all risk. So RAC is about openly discussing those risks and deciding if you're willing to take them together. And in practice, that means that kink scenes usually start with some very frank conversation and negotiation. Partners might use a checklist, a yes, no, maybe list, and talk through what acts are on the table, what's off limits, and what each person needs to feel completely safe. In kink, aftercare essentially means taking time after an intense scene to come down, to recover and to attend to each other's physical and emotional needs. Now, this might involve things like gently undoing bondage, sharing water or chocolate to restore energy, emphasis on the chocolate, cuddling, comforting words, but just generally checking in on each other's feelings. Now, the goal is to help participants transition from heightened, altered states of the scene and back to normal life in a safe manner. Because kink scenes can be pretty intense. Like physically intense, think restraints, adrenaline, endorphins, and emotionally intense, especially when you're playing with things like humiliation, pain, and power shifts. Now, once the scene is over, the body and mind don't just snap back instantly. There can be tears, euphoria, or even what kinksters refer to as the sub-drop. This is where a sudden crashing mood happens once the adrenalines and endorphins wear off. Now, very interestingly, LARPers who play a role-playing game where they physically act things out have actually borrowed the term aftercare directly from BDSM. They sometimes call this a debriefing, which is a conversation or group ritual after the game to help players separate their characters and process any strong emotions. Some LARPers even very jokingly refer to it as de-fucking, which I think is very interesting considering the topic of this video thesis. But this is particularly important when we're acting out things physically like violence and fighting, and not just verbally. It's a very good time to check in with your friend and be like, hey mate, that was my character stabbing you in the back, not me. We're still cool. And even LARPers refer to a post-LARP drop. Feelings of intense sad or emptiness after an intense and immersive gameplay ends. Now, Bowman and Turner in 2015 note that this happens because of a communal high and emotional intensity of the game is suddenly gone. But the two ideas are essentially the same. It is to make sure that everyone is okay as they leave the magic circle of play. And even in tabletop RPGs, after a particularly intense storyline, say the death of a character or a disturbing horror scenario, a good game master will encourage a bit of post-game chat to make sure that players voice how they feel, much like an emotional check-in. And we all saw this pretty recently when a viral TikTok came out from the Bards of New York.
I can't save Snow. Can I rest early? I don't know how much I can take, but I understand if you need me to do longer.
If she is truly beyond help, then the shepherd will take you both.
I can do it better this time.
So can I. The great black blade katana. I bid you farewell, and I look forward to greeting who you become. And that is where we will end the session tonight.
Now, this video invited a lot of conversation from both people within the D&D community and outside of it about the emotional intensity of this game and the ways that we can navigate these kind of experiences together. Now, after like the 7th costume change of this video, I want to talk about something really important, and that's identity and inclusion, because both of these communities serve as safe spaces for the exploration of identity, and they do so in really profound ways. There's actually been research in communication studies that has found that tabletop RPG players use games to explore facets of their identity, especially if those facets are marginalized in real life. For LGBTQI+ individuals in particular, creating a fantasy character can be a way to express gender and orientation in a supportive environment. One study observed that queer women in particular use D&D to experiment with, express, and explore identity, interrogating underdeveloped parts of themselves through their created characters. And it works. We have scholars like Sarah Lynn Bowman who have found that players use role-playing games to explore marginalized aspects of their identity, particularly for queer and gender non-conforming people who might not otherwise have the freedom to explore this anywhere else. The table has become a kind of laboratory for selfhood. Now, compare this to kink. A BDSM scene may also be a place to experiment with identity and power. Famously, we have the example of a high-powered executive who may step into a submissive role and discover how freeing it feels to give up control. And someone who feels disempowered in their daily life may find deep joy in becoming a dominant in these scenes. And of course, for queer folks, kink spaces have historically been one of the few places where gender and sexual diversity is not only tolerated, but celebrated. Many kinky subcultures were historically part of the queer community and vice versa. The gay leather scene, for example, was a cornerstone of the early Pride movements. And if you want to learn more about that, you can read all about it in my book, Kinky History, that's now available to purchase worldwide. But there is an inclusivity in the kink spaces that is often higher. Culturally, it embraces queerness and diversity. Both of these spaces are really built on the same foundation of consent, imagination, and acceptance. You walk in knowing that as long as you play by the rules, whether that is dice rolls or safe words, you can explore, perform, and experiment without fear of judgment. And this is the one thing that really escapes the magic circle. What you discover inside of the circle doesn't just stay there. Many people come out of a D&D campaign with a better sense of who they are and what they value, and vice versa. Many kinksters describe their first scene as a life-changing experience, giving them languages, desires, or identities that they couldn't previously name. And academic discourse supports this. RPG play has been linked to increase confidence and self-understanding, and very similarly, BDSM has been described as a form of authentic self-expression for kinky folks, which is often tied to sexual orientation and core identity. And the common thread here is personal growth. Both arenas give permission to experiment with who you are inside of a community that validates consensual differences. Now, I don't think that this overlap in inclusivity is a coincidence. It stems from the very foundational values of consent, mutual respect, and imaginative openness that both of these subcultures really champion. And speaking from personal experience, both of these communities were incredibly welcoming. And I know this isn't going to be everyone's experience, but I do think that at their best, both the Dungeons and Dragons and the BDSM community pride themselves on being very accepting subcultures that often welcome people who feel like outsiders in other aspects of their life. And maybe one of the reasons that we're drawn to these communities is there is a tendency for people who share personality traits such as imagination and openness to experience. There was actually some psychological research on gamers that showed that individuals who score very highly on openness to experience, being curious, creative, open-minded, also tend to be drawn to role-playing games with very rich narratives and fantasy elements. And this makes perfect sense. Creating characters and worlds each week requires creativity and a willingness to explore novel, new ideas. But what is very interesting is there is a 2013 study on BDSM practitioners that found a very similar trait profile. BDSM folks were on average more open to new experiences and also less neurotic and more extroverted than the general public. Rather than this stereotype of deviance, they showed favorable psychological characteristics, which led researchers to conclude that BDSM is essentially a form of healthy recreational leisure for many people. Now, both gaming and BDSM are considered serious leisure. Now, this is a technical term that was coined by Robert Stebbins, and it means a hobby people pursue with dedication, skill building, and community involvement, more than just a kind of casual pastime. If you've ever rocked up to a D&D session with a 40-page backstory or attempted the Sims 4 100 baby challenge, you know exactly what this means. But both hardcore D&D players and active BDSM lifestylers treat their interest as serious leisure. They attend events, they learn skills, they form friendships around the activity, and they invest considerable time and resources. Participating in a long-running D&D campaign can very much resemble a club. There is a sense of commitment and community belonging. Also, both of these communities often experience outsider stigma from mainstream society, which ironically can strengthen in-group bonds. Finding like-minded peers through shared leisure interest, be it fantasy gaming or a little bit of spanking, provides social support and a sense of identity. I think it's also really important to note that trust and communication skills involved likely attract people who value interpersonal connection. There is even some evidence that role players and kinksters develop strong empathy. Stepping into a character or a partner's shoes can train you to read others' signals and emotions. But I think the main point here, though, is that academically, we see a convergence. Both RPG gaming and BDSM appear to attract a diverse range of basically well-adjusted people who are highly open to imaginative and community-orientated encounters. And this really counters any lingering stereotypes that D&D players are antisocial nerds, or BDSM practitioners are mentally unstable, looking at you, Christian Grey, because research shows that neither group is inherently maladjusted, and in fact they often share positive traits and use their leisure activity as a form of personal development and stress release. The connection between these two worlds isn't just practical. There is now an entire D&D expansion called Kink and Cantrips, which, as it sounds, is entirely dedicated to helping you add kinky elements into your fantasy world. You can nowadays go onto things like FetLife, which is generally an app to help people in the kink community meet up, and there you can find your own D&D group. There is entire conventions that go on annually, which are dedicated to having D&D played in one room and another kind of play in the other. And of course, comedians such as Dropout TV are often making jokes that connect these two worlds.
A Dom DM. Get on your knees. So you got a 3. Okay, so you try to get on your knees.
I really should have just said at the beginning that Dungeons and Dragons gave us Brennan Lee Mulligan. That would have made the connection to kink clear from the beginning. So why does any of this even matter? Because we see the global rise of Dungeons and Dragons, and we also see this rise of interest in the kink community from things like Kink Talk blowing up on TikTok. There is a sense that both of these communities answer something that we are craving right now. And I think in our world that is very, oversaturated with social media, we're seeing the rise of AI and of course like the ongoing social effects of the pandemic. What a lot of us are craving are genuine interpersonal relationships. And that's something that both the kink and gaming community answer in very different ways. They're both about connection, and they're both about storytelling stripped down to its very core. Maybe in one community I mean that more literally than the other, but both of them answer that desire that we are craving at this moment. And I think importantly, they're both about play for the sake of play. Ooh, that was so hot, I just stripped. But that is something, as we kind of exit this girl boss, need to be productive all of the time era, that I think many of us are finding incredibly empowering. Because at the end of the day, storytelling, connection, and play is what it means to be human. That got very deep very quickly. I think both of these communities can feel pretty intimidating to get into, so if you're new to either of them, I hope that this video has gone some of the way into putting those anxieties to rest. And of course, if you're an experienced practitioner, I hope that this video has reassured you about how cool you are. That's right, you're cool. Dr. Esme says so. And if you enjoyed lessons like this, please keep on joining me here at Kinky History. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, and there will be some extra content of this available on my Patreon. I will see you next time at Kinky History. I don't know if anyone saw how shiny my dice are actually. Look how shiny they are. Shiny.